Hello cloud experts. Security is one of the biggest concerns in public cloud infrastructure, and now we are going to talk about one of the service related to the security domain, and that service is called as IAM, which is Identity and Access Management. My name is Sanjay Kumar and I am a cloud trainer and consultant. Now let us understand what is IAM. IAM is used to identify and access management, allows us to manage the users and how they can access the AWS resources by assigning something called as policies. Now, what is IAM? IAM is required to create various users, groups, roles and something called as policies, and these policies are assigned to users, groups as well as the roles so that they can work with your AWS resources. So they can create AWS resources and manage AWS resources based on the policies assigned to them. Now, understanding IAM is very important both for the certification as well as managing real life AWS accounts. So it is from the both perspective it is very important because we will get a lot of questions related to IAM in the certification as well as managing your real-time AWS infrastructure. IAM is equally important. IAM allows us to create many users in a single account and control their access to the AWS resources. So we can create many users and we can also control what actually they are able to do with the AWS infrastructure. Now, what are the various features of your IAM? So IAM offers centralized control of your AWS account. So we have single AWS account, but we will have various users and permissions so that they can do limited things with our AWS account. So we have centralized control over our AWS account. Shared access, the access to the resources is shared between number of users. Granular permissions, the permissions can be fine granular so that they can do what they're supposed to do by using those username and passwords. Identity federation, so you can use Active Directory, Facebook, LinkedIn, and you can use identity federation by using some of these tools. It also allows you to have MFA. MFA is called as multi-factor authentication. By using that, you can have authentication with multiple factors. So one factor of your authentication can be your username and password, but other than this, we can also have some hardware and software MFA tools which can be used for authenticate you further. It also integrates with many other AWS services. It also has something called as password rotation policies, and this IAM feature is PCI DSS compliant. So whenever we are having a credit card and debit card, so for that there are some standards called as PCI DSS, and IAM is also compliant with that. What are the key terminologies we have in the IAM? Called as users, groups, policies and roles. So let us understand what are these different terminologies what we have in the IAM. So let's talk about users. Users are typically individuals or employee of an organization, and they are typically called as users who can have access to the AWS resources. However, a number of users who requires similar capabilities, we group them together by using something called groups, and all the users of similar authority can be grouped together, and we will assign this policy to the group itself instead of giving this policy to the end user. And all the users will have the group permissions. So whatever permissions are given to the group, those permissions will be there with the user as well. The third one is called the roles. Roles are created whenever some AWS resources accessing other AWS resources. So these kind of things are required. The roles are typically required when we have some users who want to access some AWS resources, want to access some other AWS resources. For example, some of the compute services, they want to access some resources on storage. So we need to give them a role which will allow them to access S3, which is typically the storage service. However, users, groups and roles by default have absolutely no authorities. So to give them some access to the resources, we also need to create something called as policy, and these policies are typically some JSON documents which are assigned to either users, or groups or roles. However, so we can have multiple policies given to the users, groups and roles, and all those policies are typically the JSON documents and which will define what are the permissions you have to access those resources. Let's move forward. So let us understand what are the different type of users. We have one user which is called as root user. Root user is the one which is created by default whenever you create your AWS account, and it carries highest permissions and this should not be shared with anybody. So root user should not be shared with anybody and it is created by default whenever you actually create your AWS account, and this carries some of the highest permission related to your AWS infrastructure. Users are individuals from your organization which can be given different level of permissions. So different users in an organization, they are supposed to do various different things with the AWS infrastructure, and they should be given the permissions to do those things at the different levels. Groups are typically a group of users which requires the similar or same permissions. However, what we can do is we can have multiple users in the same group, but one user can be a part of multiple groups as well. And in addition to this, we can have user is having some additional policies more than which is available for all other users in the group. So we can assign separate policies to individual users in one particular group. However, it is not mandatory for users to become a part of a group, and one user can become member of multiple groups. So both things are true. It is not mandatory for one particular user to become a member of a group. I can have individual policy for a particular user. At the same time, one user can become member of multiple groups as well. Now, what is IAM policy? IAM policy, this is typically a JSON document, so which is written here in the JSON. So if we see statement, it says effect, allow, action, S3, and resources, start. What it says? That means this particular policy defines some allow attributes to a user on which particular service? S3 service, which is typically called as simple storage service, and this is applicable to all the resources in the S3. So this user will be able to create buckets. We have something called as buckets which we'll discuss further. So it will be able to create access buckets. It will be able to look at the objects, delete the objects, create the objects, upload the objects. So it will be able to do everything, each and everything in the S3 services. However, if I give this policy to somebody, he will not be able to access the resources in EC2. So he will not be able to do that, create a EC2 instance. If you are not sure about what is S3 and what is EC2, don't worry. We are going to talk about all these things one by one. Now, IAM policies, they are typically assigned to users, groups, as well as roles, depending on what are their access levels. One user, group and role can have multiple policies. So it is not mandatory to have all the permissions in one policy. You can have different permissions in different policies, and you can assign more than one policy to one particular user, group or role. These policies are typically JSON documents, JavaScript object notation documents. Always follow the least permission principle and do not give permission more than what they should do. So by default, users, groups and roles are not allowed to do anything. So by default, they have absolutely no permissions and they are not able to access any resources in the AWS infrastructure. However, whenever we are giving them permissions, we should make sure, we should understand what they are actually they have to do with the AWS infrastructure, and we should always go ahead with the least permission principle. We should always give them the minimum permissions to use AWS resources depending on their job roles. By default, there are no permissions given to users, groups and roles. So by default, there are absolutely no permissions, and all these permissions are actually given by the policy documents. IAM roles. The roles are required when AWS resources are trying to access other AWS resources. For example, one EC2 instance want to write some files in S3, which is simple storage service, then EC2 will be assigned with a role which will give them access to the S3 with a policy of S3 access. So in this scenario, we will create a policy called as S3 access, and that S3 access policy will be created using a role. A role will be created, and that role will be given this policy, which is S3 access, and EC2 will be assigned with that particular role. So in this case, EC2, which is typically like a virtual machine, will access the S3 resources by using a policy which is S3 access. So Amazon EC2 will have a role, and in that role there will be a policy, and by using that policy it will be able to read and write files in simple storage service, which is typically called as Amazon S3. Now, how to use AWS resources? There are various ways to use AWS resources. You can do it by using AWS console, which is typically a graphical user interface. CLI, command line interface, which requires something called as access key, that we will see in the next session what is access key and how these access keys are being used. We will have some API and SDK, which is software development kit, APIs and SDKs, and they can also access the resources by using access keys. So this is how typical access key looks like. So they have something called as access key ID, and you need to have that secret access key and the secret access key, which is not shown here. So these things will be used for programmatic access, which is typically used for CLI or API and SDKs. Please make sure you don't share your access key ID and the secret access key with anybody who you are not very sure how they are going to use these things. Multi-factor authentication. Somebody getting access to the username and password can access your AWS resources. So sometimes it can be dangerous if somebody steals your username and password, and they can do whatever they want in the AWS resources. To avoid this, what we do is we just add one extra layer of login security, and we enable MFA, which can be done based on some hardware MFA devices called as, for example, this is Gemalto, and we can also do it by virtual MFA devices, that is Google Authenticator. There are multiple apps and multiple devices which are available to do MFA. However, just to take an example, we have used Gemalto and Google Authenticator. So you simply need to install this application in a mobile phone, and absolutely no issues. If you lose your phone, you can easily by using different mechanism, you can easily break this MFA alignment with your AWS account, and you can also do it by using the AWS support. So it gives you extra layer of security. So without using this Google Authenticator app, nobody will be able to access in your AWS account. Now the username, so extra layer of security, username and password, and after that what you have is some MFA device, and in this case I have taken example of an app called as Google Authenticator. So we can use Google Authenticator app to make our AWS account secure. That's all in this session. So in the next session, we will have some hands-on practice on IAM, and we will discuss all these things what we have discussed in this session. So thanks for watching this session, and look forward to see you in the next session.